Dani Rodrik, professor e investigador de economia política. Cidadão da Turquia residente nos Estados Unidos, é um pensador original das causas e consequências da globalização. Rodrik é respeitado pelos que idolatram, assim como pelos que temem a crescente interdependência da economia e política globais. Uma economia global sem governo global é uma contradição. Para Dani Rodrik, a globalização é um conjunto de grandes oportunidades e também uma ameaça à democracia. A globalização foi longe demais?
I think you can export the idea of democracy, but I don't think you can actually impose democracy on other countries by invading them. So I think there are some truly global norms, and I think human rights and democracy is one of them. I don't think any country, any political group in the world would be justified if they said, we're different. We don't care about human rights, or we don't need human rights, or our people don't deserve democracy, or we should, there's no reason why we ought to be democratic until much later in the development. You might implement those values differently, but these are true global norms, and I think that to have arrived at, I think, is a major achievement. Now, how are we going to make this compatible with the economic transitions we're going through, with the forces of globalization, is clearly the challenge of the decades that lay ahead of us.
What do you think is the relation between globalization and freedom?
It's a complicated one. It's clearly, on the one hand, globalization enhances our freedom to trade, to move around, to invest our money wherever we want in the world, and so these are important freedoms. In fact, probably one of the most important freedoms that we can have is to move around the world freely. And even though in the current phase of globalization, this is not something that is part of the landscape, certainly in the 19th century, in a previous era of globalization, one of the important facets of globalization was that people could move around freely without a passport, without any traveling papers. So that kind of mobility, I think, was an important part of freedom. At the same time, I think there's an element of freedom which is our ability to shape the social and political environment in which we live. And there is an important sense in which I think economic globalization, the expansion of markets, the increased power of international finance, international banks, multinational corporations, competition across nations for resources, for revenue, for investment. There's a sense in which that diminishes our freedom to shape our social and political environment. It diminishes our voice. And I think we see it all the time when politicians tell us, in response to us, the people's request, well, we cannot do it because we live in a global environment that we have to compete, and therefore our ability to do this or that is limited. And I think so there's this real sense in which our political choices have been constrained. So I think clearly the task is to combine the positive freedom expanding elements of globalization, but that also has the implication that ultimately globalization is something we have to manage. Globalization, I think, has tended to exert an equalizing force in the last 30 years across the globe, but has exerted unequalizing forces within countries. That is, it has driven the rich and the poor apart within individual nations, but clearly has enriched hundreds of millions of Chinese and a lot of people in India, a lot of people even in Africa. And so if we look at the global income distribution without paying a lot of attention as to individuals as members of countries, the global income distribution in the last 30 years has actually has improved. We've generated a global middle class. But individually in countries, that has meant somewhat paradoxically that within countries income inequality is actually widened. That's certainly true in most of the countries of the advanced nations. Even in China, of course, China has done a lot in terms of poverty reduction. It's clearly been a very, very rapidly growing country. But within China, income inequality has really exploded in the last 30 years. So that second phenomenon is damaging from the perspective of national cohesion, from the national political dialogue, for our, the coherence of institutions and so forth. But clearly the first, from a global standpoint, is very good, that a lot of poor people have really lifted themselves up from abject poverty, and we now can talk about a global middle class. So it's another mixed picture there.
As the market seems to expand everywhere, there are all these movements that advocate kind of a retreat from the market. Communitarianism, there are movements in Greece, no money economies, things like that.
Yeah.
And sometimes with very high hopes. What do you think about this?
Well, historically, I think one of the interesting aspects of the spread of markets and the opening up of economies to international trade and the global economy has been that it's always been a double movement. That process of economic opening has always been accompanied by a process of broadening and expansion of social insurance, the broadening and expansion of social safety nets. So the whole history of the 20th century is really a double history of the expansion, with significant interruptions, of course, of economic globalization, but also of the significant expansion of the public sector, of the state. And I don't think this is quite a coincidence, that this temporal correlation is also one that exists in the cross-section. That is to say, countries that are much more open to trade, that are much more exposed to the global market, are also countries that tend to provide much greater security through the public sector, whether it is in the advanced countries in the form of transfers and social insurance and the welfare state, or it is in the form of public employment, which is the main mechanism through which such insurance is provided in the poorer countries, in the developing countries. So in my work, actually, I've documented these regularities, that the open economy and the big state are really two sides of the same coin. Now, I think this bargain, which is to say, we are willing to be thrown into the risks and uncertainties and the fluctuations of these uncertain, big, large markets, as long as we have some safety nets, as long as we have these mechanisms of social insurance. That bargain becomes frayed when globalization expands to such a degree that, in fact, the ability of states to provide the response needed becomes significantly weakened. So if you think about that double movement that I've talked about, the ability of the state to expand relies on the ability of the state to raise its resources, to tax and redistribute through mechanisms of social insurance. After all, social insurance is a mechanism where we're effectively redistributing income from the more lucky to the less lucky. However, when the more lucky now feel themselves part of this global economy, so they can move around themselves and their resources so that they don't need to be taxed, they don't need the rest of society as much, going back to some of the things we were talking about earlier, then the ability of the states to raise the resources needed to finance the social insurance mechanisms, the safety nets, also becomes significantly weaker. And then we have this tension because then there is much greater resentment to the open economy, much greater resentment to globalization, and what happened to be a complementary process now becomes a process of tension. That globalization is viewed as undermining security, undermining the social compact, and the mirror image of that, the demand of people for social insurance and redistributive transfers is viewed by the lucky or by the rich or by the skilled as undermining the expansion of further globalization.
So in a sense, you've globalized economic institutions, corporations, etc., but there's no world governance or government to match. Is that it? Right. So, if you again look at it historically, I think the great achievement of the 19th and 20th centuries was the creation of fully integrated national markets. And these national markets were fully embedded within national institutions of governance. And these institutions of governance ran from, legal regimes, regulatory regimes, to monetary and fiscal institutions to stabilize these markets, social insurance and social safety nets and welfare states to provide for social insurance, and ultimately, of course, mechanisms of democracy and political accountability to legitimize these institutions of markets. And all of those were national. So national markets were embedded within national political systems, national systems of institutions. Now, from the middle of the 20th century on, so we started to build a global system of markets, whereas our system of governance remained largely national.
And that led to all kinds of problems of legitimacy and inefficacy and financial instability and so forth. And we're still living with the consequences of those, again, with the Eurozone being an extreme example of that. So I'm very skeptical that we could actually construct a governance globally that is so encompassing, so thick, and so full of democratic checks and balances globally that could fully underpin a true economic globalization, a world market that is as unified and integrated as domestic markets are. So that's why that's what I mean by sometimes needing to take a step back, which is that it may be better, even for economic globalization, to try to have an economic globalization that is not as ambitious, but one that can be sustained, one that has the various safety valves and the mechanisms of regulation and insurance that we need to sustain markets.
Political freedom is a kind of insurance against major mistakes.
Well, political freedom is, from an instrumental standpoint, yes, that it's giving you much greater stability and predictability. So, in a sense, if you want to look at it, if you are looking at what kind of a regime I want to live in, not knowing what kind of economic future you're going to have in the next 30, 40 years, do I take a gamble on an authoritarian regime where I can either get a very bad, cruel, and disastrous ruler, or I can get a benevolent dictator, or do I want to sort of play it safe? And I think most of us would rather sort of play it safe, especially if we know that democracies can't afford to make big mistakes, because if you get big mistake, you get booted out. Another government comes in. Then, of course, the other thing is the success of China has raised sort of new questions in people's mind as to whether, in fact, as we were discussing before, you should delay democracy until you become a bit richer. But as I've suggested, I think that's a false choice. So I think what we see in practice is a rise in what Fareed Zakaria called illiberal democracies. A lot of countries that are regimes where governments are elected every 4 years or 5 years, but they effectively civil liberties and political liberties are being constrained. And so I think this is one of the rather disappointing trends of the last 20 years, that even though more countries are nominally democratic, the quality of democracy in almost all of them is deteriorating.
Do you think there is a future for freedom and prosperity?
The future is definitely for freedom and prosperity, I think, for increased prosperity for a large part of the world. I do think that one of the very important norms that got established in the towards the end of the 20th century is the global norm for democracy. Now, there's a good thing and then a slightly less good thing that has happened. One is that democracy became such a norm that more of the world became democratic, and the debate about whether democracy was a luxury good, I think largely dissipated. I think, however, and this is the less good development in more recent years, is that the luster of democracy has begun to fade for a number of reasons. One is because the quality of democracy in the advanced countries has been degraded, partly because of all the effects of these forces of economic globalization that we talked about before. One of the reasons that our political discourse has deteriorated is because there is much less of a sense of we're all in this together. And what has happened is that the most skilled, the richest in our societies feel themselves much more part of a global community, much less members of their local community. So if you look at various global surveys, there is a very visible stratification by social class, by income, as to whether people feel themselves members of their local community or feel themselves members of a global community. The more skilled you are, the richer you are, the better educated you are, the less likely that you're going to feel yourself a citizen of your nation or a citizen of your local community, much more that you'll feel yourself a cosmopolitan. And that just reflects the reality that it's relatively easy for you to move around, and you are a beneficiary of this cosmopolitan system. Whereas if you're a member of the middle class, a worker, somebody who's in the public sector, somebody who doesn't necessarily have the skills that receive big return in global markets, really you care about what's happening in the nation because you're really stuck. And corporations had a sense in the 50s and 60s and maybe in the 70s that they had to look out for their communities because they were part of that community. They were stuck too. They were there. And I think that has diminished to a significant extent. So there is indeed this phenomenon that Albert Hirschman had identified of exit and voice, which is that as the rich and the professional and the more skilled see the exit option as much more present, their willingness to engage in a debate, their willingness to exercise voice in their society gets diminished. And that impoverishes, I think, our national discourse, our political debates. And that's been one of the sense in which I think our democracies have become impoverished, with the quality of the debate and discussion degraded.